Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet of ours. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable, carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining this conversation with a returning guest. As climate change accelerates and ecosystems are further strained by extractive industries, the question isn't just how we reduce harm, it's how we generate benefits to nature. What if we had a shared language to value nature not just for what it provides economically, but for how it supports all life? What if communities, companies, and governments could align around a new ecological standard that's not rooted in carbon accounting alone, but in regenerating the very systems that sustain life, including human life? That's the vision behind the Ecological Benefits Framework, a bold and, let's just say it, beautifully designed tool developed by Douglas Gayeton and his team at the Lexicon. You may remember that the EBF launch was featured on Sustainability in Your Ear in 2023, and we wanted to touch base for an update about this important project. Douglas is a storyteller, filmmaker, and social innovator who dedicated his career to reshaping the way that we think and talk about food, farming, and the planet. His work has been featured in PBS, National Geographic, and museums around the world, and it pairs immersive visual narratives with systems thinking to bring complex sustainability ideas to life for the viewer. With the Ecological Benefits Framework, Douglas is tackling one of his most ambitious projects yet. The framework identifies 6 core areas that must benefit to qualify a project as regenerative. That is, that it has to benefit air, water, soil, biodiversity, equity, and carbon. The framework provides a practical way for communities, nonprofits, funders, and investors to measure regeneration, not just financial risk. The EBF is being piloted across 24 case studies globally and will soon be featured on a BBC series called Unearthing the Future. Today, we're going to unpack how the EBF came to be, explore what it looks like in action, and hear how Douglas envisions this becoming a new baseline for ecological storytelling and investments. You can learn more about the Ecological Benefits Framework at the ebfcommons.org website. EBF Commons is all one word, no space, no dash, ebfcommons.org. And if you'd like to learn more about Douglas and his work, visit thelexicon.org. That's also one word with no space, no dash, thelexicon.org. We're going to get to the conversation right after this brief commercial break. Welcome to the show, Douglas. How you doing today?
I'm doing awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. We participated in the launch of the EBF, and I wanted to ask how you're doing with it. But first, can you tell us how the idea for the Ecological Benefits Framework first took root with you? What was the specific gap in environmental and regenerative reporting that you were trying to address?
Well, for 5 years, I created and ran a program with funding and support from Google called Can You Change the Future? And it had about 1,000 companies and NGOs in it. And it ran for 5 years. It looked at everything from how meat works on a regional level to alternative proteins to regenerative agriculture to food as medicine. It was a pretty diverse collection of subjects, even food packaging and single-use plastics. And what was an interesting theme that emerged across all of those different spheres of work is that increasingly people don't care about certifications. Now, I don't say that with a jauntist view of certifications. It's just that certifications, while valuable, are essentially designed to warrant that you did something and that someone validated that you actually did something. But doing something is not the same as actually generating the result. And I think people are realizing increasingly that it's less important to say that you did something and more important to show you what happened because you did something. And instead of a certification model that is checking a lot of boxes, people are trying to determine and they're coalescing around what are the impacts that they need to achieve most. So we've had 12,000 years of perfecting what would be an extractive economy. And we've
Hmm.
applied this extractive mentality to all of the resources around us. In fact, we've lived with this notion that our resources are infinite only until a generation ago, where we began to realize, hang on a second, this air, this water, these soils, these are actually finite resources
Yeah.
that that can be degraded or improved by our activities, right? So every child learns that you have to put away what you pick up, that you have to clean up your room, you know. But as adults, we've somehow forgot all of those really valuable lessons that we are taught as children. And one of them is the responsibility to mitigate the wake that we make as we move through the world. And so what emerged with these activators that we did was, as I said, people caring less about certifications and more about impacts. And what was really amazing is they settled on the same six every time. I went back to Google and I said, I hate to bum you out. I know that we spend a lot of time and energy on this, but I can reduce our learnings to 6 words. I'm sorry, it's so simple, but that's how it works. We then brought a number of companies to Mountain View and asked them to explain their ESG reporting. And it turned out that their ESG reporting did not go beyond those 6 words that we had determined. And those 6 words were air, water, soil, biodiversity, equity, and carbon. And when companies try to show that they're mitigating the negative externalities that they're creating, they end up talking about activities in those 6 areas. Invariably, it's one of those uncanny truths that are right in front of us. And if we were to think about it logically, we'd go, well, of course, but yet we've never actually done something with it. So what we did was we said, this is a ecological benefits framework for how
Hmm.
to reverse and mitigate 12,000 years of extraction and extractive practices, and how you reverse that trend and make people more mindful. And one of the things that we determined was you can't tell people how to do what they're doing differently. You can't tell them how to measure what they do differently. Everyone has systems that they've invested time and money in. So instead of getting people to operate on the head end, in other words, on the ground in their operations, on how they're measuring their impact, what we said is, what if we could get them to explain the outcomes, how you
Hmm.
visualize what the result of those capturing those positive impacts? And what if we created a standard framework? Now, it's not a new idea. I mean, when the tech companies created the first smartphones at the beginning of the 2000s, imagine the chaos that would have reigned if every smartphone had to have a different way to talk to every smart device. That
Yeah.
would mean that if you went to rent a car like a Hyundai, you couldn't rent it if you had an Apple phone because Hyundai, being Korean, would be based upon a Samsung smartphone protocol. They figured out, they got together, they said, yeah, this is crazy. We're going to have to collaborate even though we're competitors. And they created Bluetooth. So Bluetooth is a digital handshake that allows any smartphone to talk to any smart device. Bluetooth is actually a nonprofit. And so what we said was, why can't we make a Bluetooth for the planet? Why can't we create a framework that allows everyone, regardless of their activities, regardless of how they talk about the impacts that they're trying to positively address, what if we could have a standard way? So that's how the ecological benefit framework began. And so we had a group of almost 200 people from the carbon market space and a lot of other players join in to figure out how we might apply that. We took projects from around the world, and then we were able to render them using this framework. And it was a very powerful exercise that we then released at Climate Week in New York a few years ago. And then from there, you know, it's really taken off, and we've been racing to keep up with it.
Now, let's talk about the frame in which this recognition of the limits to the resources that we live or depend upon was realized. The other thing that happened in that same generation was the explosion of media and the ability for us to reach and communicate all of these stories about the impacts that we have on the world. You're a communicator by nature and by training. How is media essential to changing human society and individual behavior at this particular moment in time?
Well, you know, our organization is the lexicon, so we focus on language. That's what our primary focus is. And you know, our thinking is that if you teach somebody a word that might be the most radical activity you could have. And those words are essentially the toolbox that you use to form ideas. So in teaching people the right words, you can unlock new ways for them to communicate, new ways for them to understand things that they might otherwise not understand. When we began in lexicon, we began gathering these taxonomies, these ways that people speak across all these domain areas. And what was
Hmm.
really interesting about that is that it's almost it's like almost a curse that the the higher level or degree of expertise that you have in a domain area, it's almost like this inverse curve that the more you know about something, the more difficult it is for you to explain it to a
Yeah.
layperson.
Yeah. We're more insulated and jargon oriented when we talk as an expert.
Well, sure, and and you should be, right. So you
Yeah.
are essentially speaking at very high level on a high level conceptual landscape with other experts. So of course you're going to be using technical jargon. So what we did from the very beginning of the lexicon was we went one domain area after another, and the first thing we had experts do is, and we use natural language processing tools, like all kinds of tools
Mhm.
to identify if you're an expert talking about something, what is the language that you're using. We then found ways to make that language easier for civilians, for common people to understand. And invariably, along the way, those experts asked us to help them in communicating otherwise complex ideas in ways that general people could understand. So that resulted in books that we've done. We've had
Mhm.
about 2,000 exhibits explaining these concepts just in food and agriculture, TV shows with PBS. So we've really spent the last 15, 20 years really helping experts explain the nuances of what they've learned in their travels, in their journeys, with their research, so that a layperson can understand. Because if the bulk of a population doesn't grasp and have an immediate sense of the importance of key concepts, you're never going to get widespread adoption of the things that you need to have to create solutions. I'll give you an example. The experts in the areas of specifically food and agriculture, but now it's in other places, have identified that in the 20th century, as we rapidly industrialized across all these different sectors, we began really focusing on making things as cheaply as possible. And so, one of the ways that you can make something as cheaply as possible is by not considering, for example, the negative environmental consequences that result. That's why
Yep.
you have, Superfund sites, EPA Superfund sites, where companies produce something at great rate and pollute local waterways or groundwater, and then abandon those factories and sites and moved on someplace else. And so we're left with the residue of that, and those are what's called the negative externalities of an
Mhm.
operation. So economists began talking about ways to factor in all those negative externalities into the price of something, and they began talking about true cost accounting, the idea
Mhm.
that you're not actually paying the real price when you're buying something, and so what you're doing is you're paying a artificially low price that encourages even more waste and even more environmental degradation. And so the true cost movement came out of that, and kind of sister to that was this idea of these planetary boundaries that we can't go beyond. And then what came out of that was something else called the circular economy, this idea that you have to look at everything you're doing along the way of making something and address all of the negative externalities along the way to try to mitigate them. Each of those three examples have been the dominant approach in industry internationally to mitigate negative externalities. The problem is both a language problem, consumers don't understand what circularity is,
Right.
and it's also a problem that it's the wrong way to look at something, because nobody gets out of the bed in the morning to do less bad. And so these are all do less bad models. True cost accounting, the circular economy, the 9 planetary boundaries. These are all we need to do less bad. And ironically, that makes zero sense to a general, like to the general public.
Nobody likes to hear the word no.
Nobody likes to hear the word no, But what if you got out of bed in the morning to do more good?
Hmm.
And what if you were part of collective enterprises that led to more good? And it's partially behavior, understanding behavior engineering. It's partially communications. And it's partially that while all of the answers presented by true cost accounting or nine planetary boundaries or the circular economy, they're correct. They have never taken hold with the general public because they are these do less bad models. And so the ecological benefit framework said these are the 6 areas where you can do more good. So the irony of ironies is that it turns out that when you do more good, that means as a consequence that you're doing less bad. And so it's taking that same collection of data sets and applying them towards positive impacts as opposed to mitigating negative externalities. That's the role, and I would say the unheralded role that understanding communication um, plays in getting people to do the right thing and to take more responsibility and being wedded to being solution oriented as opposed to being, dealing with risk.
So, how can a consumer use the EBF to make a better decision, to do some good? And let's say, just in particular, with regard to air or water, how would they assess that opportunity?
Well, so we made a couple of really we had a couple of radical conclusions that came out of our first sprint with the ecological benefits framework, and that framework primarily um, focused on people and carbon markets. It was actually funded by people and carbon markets, and it
Hmm.
was funded by the enabling technologies, that would be cryptocurrencies, blockchain, et
Hmm.
cetera, that are kind of the plumbing that allows um, that marketplace to work. But my problem with the carbon market is that it's it's a mostly disingenuous marketplace in the sense that we have people that, I mean, it's pretty pathetic that it's 2025 and our primary methodology used to address climate change is a privatized marketplace where people profit off of claims that are made that are not standardized and often of dubious value. And it's pretty embarrassing that we're only focusing on carbon because anytime a butterfly or a bird or a lizard goes extinct, that means it's not coming back. That's a forever event. So you can't tell me that biodiversity loss is less important than sequestering carbon. Uh, you could say the same for air and water. Nature doesn't think in terms of benefits and co-benefits. Nature, as it turns out, understands that they're all intrinsically connected.
Yeah.
And so we started in the carbon market, and we started by trying to explain to people in carbon markets that they are really doing a disservice, not a service, but a disservice because they're not embracing the holistic nature of how natural systems work. It's essentially malpractice to participate in carbon markets because you're essentially operating under the assumption that these other areas aren't worth monitoring or are not of value or are not connected. It's how you create unintended consequences, you know. And so when you look at air and water quality, you can't again fall into the same trap that people have fallen into in carbon markets. These all have to be addressed holistically. And so what happened after our first sprint, which was in a pretty amazing journey and one of those classic cases of a project that didn't have an enemy, everyone realized the value of it is. I had an individual from the World Bank who approached me afterward and he said, you've been talking all about the carbon market, but the carbon market is fractional compared to the amount of money that's deployed by multilateral development banks to address these challenges. And when multilateral development banks address these challenges, they do it holistically, as nature does. And so they said to me, you should focus the next phase of the ecological benefits framework on working with multilateral development banks.
Hmm.
And so at the same time, we were approached by the World Food Program, who said, can you use this to explain the economic um, activities that are required to make an impact on the ground. So they talked about Chad, for example, in the Sahel. So, very challenging because of political unrest and because of drought. It's a very challenging area of the world. And interestingly enough, during that same period, we were approached by in global agriculture, there are 15 centers which are called the International Centers for Agriculture Research, which obviously makes sense. Like there would be one for rice or wheat or corn.
Mhm. Yep.
Do exist. They're called the CGIRs. So the CGIRs approached us after they looked at the Ecological Benefits Framework. And so the World Food Program, what ended up being the Asia Development Bank, which I think is the second largest multilateral development bank in the world, and the CGIRs approached us all within 2 weeks of us presenting this work, the first phase of work for EBF, and said, how can you help us to standardize how we talk about impacts? And so for the past 16 months, I've been all over the world. I've been in the Sahels. I've been, all through Africa, South America, Asia, and I'll kind of walk through them really, really quickly. Each of them are different. The World Food Program in Chad, they have people on the ground trying to explain what they're doing and trying to standardize how they gather information and then how they can assess it. But it turns out they have no standardized way to do that. Everybody's just gathering whatever information they can on the fly, which then can't really be integrated into a system where you can assess the impacts so that you can make better decisions down the road. The result is you're gathering a lot of information that you don't need, and you're gathering information that isn't interoperable with other information. So the World Food
Noise in the system, would you describe that as, or is that something we can tune out?
I think that what you often have is maybe you have a group at the World Food Program that's interested in gender, or another
Mhm.
one that's the agriculture team, another one that is a nutrition team, and so you have these different teams of different objectives, and they have different data gathering methods that they use on the ground, and they're gathered, placed digitally in a cloud, but not in formats that are interoperable, and so having things like a standardized question set that gathers information in standardized areas that are then replicable in other nations in the Sahels, it will allow them to understand um, what is working, what isn't. Because when you have international aid, the thing that you don't want to do is keep on doing the same exercise or activity that isn't useful in other places, hoping to somehow have a different result. But you do want to see what works and double down on that, like time and time again. That's the great problem of international NGOs, is how do you replicate success? So EBF allowed them to have a framework to do that. In the case of the CGIRs, these 15 International Centers for Agriculture, um, these are the people on the ground working with farmers in 100 countries, around 100 and something countries around the world. They have coalesced around two principles that drive their agriculture philosophy, let's say. One is
Okay.
agroecology, and the other one is nature positive solutions.
Mhm.
But yet, ironically, they don't have a standardized framework to assess what works, so that they can replicate it elsewhere. Now, you might say, well, these things are all very place-based, and so you have to take into account that what works in one place won't work someplace else. Absolutely, that's true. But within any model, whether it's agroecology or nature positive solutions, you have to there's a set of universal principles, and then you have to have an adaptive framework to show you can localize that in different areas, different regions. But if you don't have a standardized question set from the very beginning, again, you might be gathering information that's not useful to anybody, and you're not gathering the right
Yeah.
information that could lead to better operational decision making. So that led to the Lexicon team, us going, to Kenya and going, and go India and Colombia, and these other countries to work on the ground with these agronomists and plant breeders, soil scientists, community organizations, to help them come up with a standard framework. And now we've done that. So we've now built the world's first standardized framework that explains nature positive solutions. And this ecological benefit framework was the really efficacious tool that allowed us to get there. And in 2025 and 2026, we will expand that out even further in nature positive solutions and also in agroecology. So they finally now have a framework of interoperability that can help them to identify what to double down on. In the case of the Asian Development Bank, well, they have a $20 billion fund in
Mhm.
Asia for coastal restoration. And so I spent the last year, shuttling back and forth to Cambodia. Cambodia is one of 4 nations in the world that have been red flagged. You can't buy seafood from that country because of the mismanagement of their fisheries. And so what they're trying to do through all these interventions that are creating livelihoods for women and better stewardship practices and in coastal fisheries, they need to be able to show their donors what success looks like. And increasingly what that success is how they are contributing positively in those areas that I've outlined in air, water, soil, biodiversity, equity, and carbon. We have a carbon credit now, and we have increasingly a biodiversity credit.
Right, they're
But it
growing.
right, but it's in many ways it's silly. It's like people are bolting a biodiversity credit not often onto the side of a carbon credit. But you know, as we've seen over the last 12 months in India, the air quality is so poor in some areas that people have negative health consequences even inside their own homes and indoors. And so there's going to be an air credit in India in the next 2 to 3 years. We're seeing the same thing with water throughout much of North Africa, and now even going down into East Africa. We're going to be seeing water credits that are going to emerge, and these are inevitabilities. As we continue to degrade our soils, people are going to connect regenerative agriculture with a soil credit, and so invariably we're going to end up with credits in all 6 of these areas, and we can either do it sequentially in a kind of a non-structured way, or simply bite the bullet and identify that these are the 6 areas we need to address and begin tracking data when we're on the ground that actually expresses what these values are, the impacts that we can have to mitigate the negative externalities that we've created through our extractive practices in the 6 areas. But these are inevitabilities. It's not like uh, an idealized notion of how to respond to the planet. We're going to have to create a way to identify impacts, which might include credits, but also, credits are one way. There's many ways to address the flow of capital. There's the marketplace in terms of
Mhm.
consumer goods. There's philanthropic activities that give grants. There's governments that can provide loans, and then there's the venture community that can provide investments. And the reason why we don't have an acceleration towards addressing these challenges in a holistic way is because we aren't measuring. And so if we're not coalescing around these are the positive areas where we need to create impact, and if we're not identifying what our activities are that can help to mitigate that, we're never going to be able to reverse um, the situation where we now find ourselves, which is we're really we're really degrading at a rapid scale um, everything around us because we don't have a positive outlook on what we can do to mitigate that as individuals.
Douglas, this is a great basis for the rest of our conversation, but we need to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back. Now let's get back to our conversation with Douglas Gayeton. He is the co-founder and chief lexicographer at The Lexicon, which is launching the Ecological Benefits Framework. That's a science and culturally grounded method for quantifying environmental impact. So, Douglas, the EBF includes equity as one of the environmental benefits. That's a controversial word these days, though it shouldn't be because it belongs in a discussion about nature. After all, we're part of it, not separate from nature. But how do you suggest we think about human socioeconomic impacts when assessing regenerative projects?
Well, equity is a it's a wormhole.
Hmm.
Um, the five, air, water, soil, biodiversity, and carbon are carbon. You could say carbon. You could say carbon equivalence. You could say climate
Hmm. Yeah,
change.
sure.
Um, but in the United States, people talk about regenerative agriculture. And what's
Hmm.
funny, when I ask them to explain what regenerative agriculture is, they talk about all of these social elements, none of which are actually regenerative agriculture. But I don't want to point out to people that
Yeah, I understand.
what they're really talking about is agroecology. Because agroecology is, on the one side, it's these agricultural practices, many of them being indigenous or traditional
Hmm.
practices. And then on the other side is the social component, how it relates to people and
Yep.
communities, et cetera. So when people in the United States talk about regenerative agriculture, more often than not, what they're really talking about is agroecology. And so
Yeah.
the next phase of our work with the CGIARs, these 15 centers globally for agriculture, is looking at nature positive solutions in agroecology and having two spheres. One is the ecological benefit framework, and the other
Hmm.
is the social benefit framework. And
Oh, okay. Okay.
yeah,
That's
and
good
that
to
will
hear.
be the next 18 months. And then after that, in 2027, we'll finally be able to look at the economic benefit framework. And then our vision that will take us, the next 3 years to get there, is what we call SEE, which is the social, economic, and ecological benefits that we're all trying to contribute to. Um, and that's just as nature, is holistic. Uh, we really see that the C framework, which we will start to talk about in 2027, is really where we're going. Mitch, to this day, we've never spoken publicly about EBF. We've never made press releases or gone and spoken at conferences and um, made much noise about it, mainly because we really wanted to ground truth this and see how elastic it is. There's a number of things I can't get into today,
Hmm.
with companies that we're working closely with, because as ESG reporting falls apart, um, and it's what something that nobody ever knew anyway. But they're looking to explain their activities in a much more holistic way, and companies are now coming to us to do that. We've taken the path of not talking publicly about what we're doing because
Hmm.
this needs to be ground truth. It's not really ready for the general public. Um, we watched very closely at what happened with circularity and true cost accounting and planetary boundaries. How consumers never really embraced these concepts. They were more like inside baseball.
Yeah.
You know,
Jargony.
yeah. I once took a very interesting high net worth individual to a conference that was about a lot of these ideas, and he's a software engineer. And as we were leaving uh, the the place where the event was gathered, I asked him how it was, and he just shook his head and looked at me kind of sideways, and he said, "Jargoneers." And I really love that term because I think that people obviously, people in many cases make announcements of things before they start, and make great claims about what they're going to achieve and do. And I get that they're trying to get funding or they're trying to make noise and get above that noise. But we subscribe to a different notion here, which is really that this stuff is hard to do. You can't really make claims for things until you know that you're right. And more often than not, even if you know that you're right, what's the benefit of making too much noise? I remember
Well,
once, yeah, so we don't do that.
but here's the question that follows from that is what's the difference between progress and perfection in describing the potential impacts, and how do you make those incremental steps towards something that we can all have a shared understanding of?
Yeah, well, first of all, I teach at Slow Foods. Slow Food is a food movement,
Hmm.
and its headquarters is in Italy. And I teach their graduate students every year. It's actually called the course is called the storytelling of food. And I say to them the first day that whatever work that we're going to do together, everything has to be perfect. And the students just go crazy when I say that. They're like, how can you do that? You're setting
Hmm.
a very high bar. And on the last day, um, um, I put a slide on the screen and I say, there is only perfect. And then the next slide says, perfect doesn't exist.
Hmm.
So we have to we have to operate under the assumption that everything we're doing is perfect, even if knowing it does not exist.
For the time being.
Yeah, and also because people start to make quarters, or they start saying things that just irritate the hell out of me, like it's good enough, or
Uh-huh.
it's it's good enough to work right now. What's that thing about perfection is the enemy of, I don't know, something, right?
Of progress.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it is that there is you know, it's when you're developing things. A great lesson I learned from Google is the difference between being incremental and being iterative, right? And so iterative is that you're constantly releasing something. I mean, look, Google put Gmail beta on their email client, and the beta stayed there for 3 years. People thought it was called, people who didn't know how software worked, they called their software, they called their email program Gmail beta because they didn't know.
Yeah.
They,
Yeah.
but Google's idea was, this thing's, is definitely not ready. Let's release it. And I think we have to embrace, what's the software world calls MVPs and minimum viable products. We have to think iteratively. We can't wait. And so we have been putting EBF out into the world, but we've also been very sober about it, in the sense that we're aware that we don't know what we don't know, right? So we're aware that we have to ground truth this, and we've learned a lot about how it works, and how it and where it's efficacious and where it doesn't. And so we don't feel like we've not released something or not worked with something because we're not ready. We're never going to be ready, and we're constantly improving. However, Mitch, I would draw a line between that and going out and talking at Davos or something about, we figured out the solution. I'd much rather be talking at larger venues when there's already is this understanding before we've spoken among people that are using it, that it already works, and then
Hmm.
we can lay out the broader vision. But until there's the adoption, not widespread adoption, but until it's the adoption by the key players, right? So in
Yeah.
other words, when food companies make pronouncements about all the great stuff that they're doing, or what they're going to do by 2030 or whatever else it is, it has zero value. But when people actually on the ground that are doing the actual work, when they're implementing things at scale, that has value. And so that is where we spend our time, is how do you get the people that are actually doing the actual work to operationalize things? The problem, Mitch, in the case that we have, is that there's a problem in, there are institutional barriers for how we gather information to explain the impacts that we are trying to achieve. And part of those is that it costs money to gather data.
Oh, yeah.
And so often people, like, the reason why, there's only a biodiversity market, and that's emerging, and not an air and water. Of course, you could say there are certain, fragmented cases where air and water credits have been, and I have been involved in some of those. But there hasn't been a holistic model, because while people appreciate this as a valuable idea, the institutional barrier is that there's not an efficacious way to gather the data, and that data gathering comes at a cost. So you have to figure out what the minimum viable data set is. In other words, the
Yeah.
least amount of data
Exactly.
you need, right, in order to make a decision, an operational decision. And that's what we've been working on, is that real kind of, and the other thing that we work with on a daily basis is helping people to understand the difference between quantitative measurement and qualitative measurement.
Hmm.
And often there is this overabundance of trust in quantitative measurement, as opposed to qualitative measurement. And we are and which is to our great detriment. I'll give you a few examples of that. When people tell me, climate people tell me that they have gathered all this data on certain, climate markers, or let's I mean the easy one is carbon sequestration. Certain carbon sequestration markers. It turns out that everyone is gathering carbon sequestration data using a different tool, a different
Yeah. Yeah.
methodology, some more efficacious than others. And then they start to take these different data sets and they start to aggregate them. So then what they have is a bunch of data that's been gathered quantitatively, all using various tools and methodologies,
Hmm.
all of, let's say, different levels of quality that you could assign to that quantitative measurement. But now they're aggregating it. So now you can't tell which piece of data was gathered which way. But now it's
Right.
all been aggregated, right? It's how we had, it's how we had the great crisis of 2008 with mortgages, is because
Hmm.
they aggregated good mortgages with bad mortgages, and you couldn't tell what the hell was going on. And so we have a lot of this. Whenever people talk to me about large data sets, then I find out they've aggregated it from many data sets. It's useless information. But people have such a high regard for something that's considered quantitative that you can't get them to understand that the data that they're making decisions from is completely useless, pointless information, because it's aggregated and you've hidden the really valid ways of measuring carbon sequestration against the ones that actually aren't so valid. And so the Comet Farm tool, created by Colorado State and USDA, is it's the standard tool that's used in agriculture to measure your impacts. And one of the people that architected that tool worked with us on a project about regenerative agriculture, and they said that the problem is that we put too much value on quantitative data when we could qualitatively make decisions based upon what's available and based on what we know and our expertise, but we do not trust qualitative data, right? And so one of the most powerful ways to measure regenerative farming and its positive impacts was actually made by a man, Wendell Gilgert, who's like my guru from Point Blue Conservation. And Wendell Gilgert, who's always my go-to, right? Wendell Gilgert said, I asked him how he measures regenerative practices, and he said he walks out into the middle of the field and he closes his eyes and he listens.
Hmm.
And he immediately is able to figure out how many birds he can hear in the field, the type of birds that they are.
Yeah.
That tells him the types of insects, that tells him what's happening in the soil, and that tells him, those trophic relationships, all by coming from making a qualitative assessment, are, for people like Wendell Gilgert and conservationists, more valuable than all of that aggregated data about carbon sequestration. And that's
It's like indigenous wisdom. It's a different sense of our relationship with the space we're in, and one that's truly holistic.
right. And also, I don't I don't fault the incredible scientific and technological breakthroughs of the 20th century. My God, it was an extraordinary century. But it also was a century of great specialization, where
Hmm.
people became really adept or an expert in one very thin sliver of a domain area, but they suddenly lacked that holistic understanding of how it fit into everything else, which of course you could say is valuable on some level, but also we lose that holistic thinking that
Hmm.
allows us to have
Yep.
to integrate ideas that in one area in other places. An Eskimo has, I don't know, 70 something ways to describe ice. And you could say, as a result, that for an Eskimo, an adjective is a form of measurement. We don't value what is right in front of us. We don't value qualitative measurement. I was down in the Amazon last year with people, let's say, that are in carbon markets, and they were going on and on speaking to the indigenous people, through a translator that took the English to Spanish, and then from the Spanish into the indigenous language they spoke. So it was like a game of post office, but they were explaining all of the remote sensing that they were doing, and they kept on pointing at the sky. And then when that was explained to the indigenous people, they had this puzzled look on their face, and they started pointing, and they kept on using this word. And I said to the translator, "What is that word that they're using?" They're saying the high level of the trees. I mean, and I said the canopy. They said, yes, the canopy. And what the indigenous people were saying is, how can these people tell us what's happening in our rainforest when everything that they're gathering is above the canopy?
Yeah.
Everything that we're experiencing is below the canopy. But yet all these carbon credits and, forestry, credits and investments and tokenization of forests don't take into account the qualitative measurement that comes from indigenous knowledge. And so it's a really oddly, sadly imbalanced way of valuing data and of only trusting things off spreadsheets. It's why some of the people, who are really adept at understanding the integration of indigenous knowledge, when they talk about biodiversity, all they talk about, in rainforests, all they talk about is jaguars. But they set up cameras to look for jaguars because the jaguar is the apex predator.
Hmm.
Just as that bird in that field was the apex predator,
Yeah.
the jaguar, if you have jaguars, you're basically stating that there's an entire set of trophic relationships that jaguar represents. And so a jaguar is a proxy
Hmm.
for explaining biodiversity. In
Well,
Cambodia, they're trying to restore these coastal waterways, and the dugong, which is like their manatee, when the dugong returns, that signifies trophic health in coastal waters. So we have to value qualitative data side by side with quantitative data. And the reason why we don't advance in our way of looking at credits is because people are nervous about making claims that are qualitative because they believe that funders won't fund or support something unless it has a spreadsheet associated with it, even if that spreadsheet is based upon aggregated data of dubious value.
Well, so I mean, it's clear what we're talking about is how do we avoid taking a Rube Goldberg approach to integrating all of these different ways we're accounting for the things that we used to treat as externalities and still haven't fully integrated. So, as you've looked at how the EBF has been applied around the world, what surprised you most about how the framework performed across different geographies and related to different goals?
Well, I'll go back to those people, and when I was when I was down in Colombia, down in the Amazon, uh, at some point, the native people there, asked the translators to explain who I was and what I was doing.
Hmm.
And I explained EBF, and they were quiet, and they all, didn't say anything. And I said to the translator, "What don't they have? Don't they have any comment about it? Did I explain it in a way that was too complicated? Did they not understand it?" And so the translator asked them that, and then they responded to the translator, "No, what he explained to us is perfectly obvious. That's how we look at things here." So I felt very validated by the simplicity of it. The greatest challenges that I have faced and our team has faced is that people get very, very nervous because they fear that we're talking about dismantling everything that they do and throwing it all out. And they've invested, in some cases, millions of dollars in
Sure. Yeah.
platforms. And the last thing they want to do is have somebody to come and tell them that it's all invalidated and that they need to throw it all out. And so the thing that we have to constantly explain to people that we're not telling anybody to do their activities different. We're simply saying that if you want it to be understood, easily understood, you probably need to come up with a more holistic, easy to understand framework. I'm not going to say the name of the global funder, but I was in a meeting recently with a global funder that has brought us in to integrate EBF. And the global funder said to all of the scientific institutions around the table, he said, "I feel very, very bad to tell you this because we give you all this money to put these reports together, but nobody reads your reports because they're too complicated. We don't understand them. And I know we pay for them, and it's a requirement that you have to deliver that. And we do trust that you're making great strides in the work you're doing, but nobody understands your reports. And we're hoping that EBF is going to allow us to be able to see this international, this kind of Rosetta Stone that
Hmm.
helps us to understand in general terms what you're doing. When you look at the New York Times, Mitch, the New York Times is taught, I mean, newspapers, beginning whatever, 17, 1800s, they taught people how to gather, how to absorb knowledge in a
Yes.
standardized format, which is the headline, the,
Hmm.
the little quote under the headline, like of like a sentence, and then it has like the dateline, like this is Jakarta, and then it has in the first sentence it lays out the mission of what the article is going to be about, and then it goes down, and then it
And
has
you've got the inverted pyramid and
yeah,
a structure for introducing the topic, giving a summary, and then breaking it down.
right,
And it
and so
is our
yeah,
our old way of understanding information.
right, and if you look at if you think about that structure, anybody in the world can read any newspaper, if they understand the language and understand where they are, the orientation of that, and
Hmm.
basically it is 95% of it of people are not going to read the article, but they're going to just glance at the headline. Another, 3% are going to want to go deeper and they'll get to the bottom of the page where it says contingent on page 22. That's for the 2% of the people that are actually deeply interested. And you have to create
Yep.
scalable experiences that deliver the content at different scales depending upon people's interests. EBF is that. EBF is this is the high level understanding of what they're doing in these 6 areas. Now, if you go into air, this is generally what they're doing in air. Now, if you go deeper into each one of those activities, you're like, wow, this is the range of things they're doing that positively impact air quality. But we don't ever make the assumption that somebody wants to understand the totality of something.
Hmm.
It's more important for us that they get the general understanding that there's 6 things that we need to be leaning into that we should be contributing to create positive impacts in these 6 areas. That's what we should be doing. And so EBF is a way to structure knowledge that allows a layperson to have a deeper understanding in a standardized format of something that if they understood more deeply, they would probably be more deeply engaged in being part of the solution.
Well, so you're doing the work with the BBC to unearth the future and tell stories about EBF inspired projects. How are you going to translate what you just described, that orientation to the problem and the story that relates to the solution to the problem for the viewer? Tell us about that, and when does the series appear so people can start to dig into this thinking?
Sure. So first of all, the it's a group within BBC called BBC Storyworks,
Hmm.
and while we are deeply engaged with BBC Storyworks on these stories, I would not presume that we're going to be driving the editorial side of it,
That's great.
nor would I presume that we're going to be, having EBF play out across all those areas. But
Hmm.
so in a way, I would say it's too early. The cake is not in the oven. Our main role is to part of what the lexicon does is we support people in their storytelling efforts, and often they either don't have the deep relationships with a lot of the key players, uh,
Hmm.
or they don't understand maybe how those ideas integrate into a common whole. For example, most people outside of food don't know what the concept of food as medicine is, or they don't know
Hmm.
what the concept of nutrient density is. And these are kind of real kind of core drivers of really massive decision making shifts that are happening in food. So part of our role at the lexicon is always just to provide, like whether it's BBC Storyworks or companies, that deeper insight. But I think yeah, I'm curious to see how it's going to unfold. It'll be the series of episodes will be delivered in the fall, uh, and I'm hopeful that it's going to address the things that we care most deeply about, some of the domain areas that I mentioned, and but yeah, but we're still at the very beginning of a long journey.
Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing those shows. Douglas, you've been very generous with your time. How can our listeners follow your work and spread the word about EBF?
I mean, we made a decision long ago that we're not really to spend a lot of time on social media, so we
Hmm.
don't really. And I would much rather work on being like helping our partners tell their stories that have been hopefully empowered or partially enabled by our contributions. So we're not really social media focused. I mean, obviously, I am on LinkedIn, and from time to time, I will share parts of what we're doing. Um, Certainly, if people want to understand how to integrate frameworks like the Ecological Benefits Framework, or to really understand how quantitative and qualitative data can coexist and help people make better decisions, then I'm always here to support people and help them, and to help them integrate the work. All of the work that we do, Mitch, has all been, people have come to us. We don't really we're just pretty focused on trying to deal with the work that we have in front of us and getting the adoption on the ground from the key players and partners that we're working with. But so if any of your listeners fall into those buckets, then we're certainly here for them, and we would certainly love to help them in furthering their and deepening their ability to express their activities and lean more into these positive impacts in areas that we've discussed.
Well, I'm glad that you're staying focused and that you are valuing depth over that surfacey stuff that we see on social media. Douglas, thank you so much for your time today. It's been fascinating.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a conversation with Douglas Gayeton, Chief Lexicographer at the Lexicon, a creative organization that developed the Ecological Benefits Framework, and that is now testing that model with regenerative programs around the world. You can learn more about the Ecological Benefits Framework at ebfcommons.org. EBF Commons is all one word, no space, no dash, ebfcommons.org. And you can discover the story behind Douglas and the Lexicon at thelexicon.org. The Lexicon is also one word, no space, no dash. That's thelexicon.org. The Ecological Benefits Framework, as we heard, is a work in progress, but that's understandable because we know so little about nature and the universe that we live in. Even as we're learning more all the time, we recognize the gap between where we are and where we really need to be. And the idea that the EBF embodies is a basis for making practical decisions about where to invest limited resources in regenerative programs in order to make the biggest impact, biggest positive impact. Those decisions must be grounded in real world experience. And with 24 projects operating in diverse settings around the planet, Douglas's team is doing the hard and time-consuming work that can make the EBF a useful guide to understanding the positive impacts we can achieve in the race to restore nature. Douglas described the EBF as a Rosetta Stone, which, when it was discovered by archaeologists, provided a bridge between modern and ancient Egyptian languages. It created a basis for understanding a lost language. To a degree, we've lost our connection with nature, and EBF is the beginning of how we re-engage with the reality that we live in. After all, humans are still just beginning to see into the complexity, the myriad systems that add up to what we call nature. We need a basis, not just for measuring environmental impact. We need a language to talk about and to debate the means that humans will invest in to restore the planet and preserve a healthy human society. For centuries, either because we were ignorant of or chose to ignore the price the planet pays for our actions, advanced economies have treated the world in which we live as being separate from us, as externalities, as the bookkeepers like to put it, that need to be struck from consideration. Now, the dawning realization that we're intricately integrated into the world, not a visitor who has carte blanche to take home whatever souvenirs we want from the system of the world without any consequences. In the face of that, EBF can be more than a bookkeeping mechanism. It can become a basis for any decision that will impact the air, water, soil, biodiversity, carbon, and human communities we rely on for survival. And it can be the foundation for investing to create a thriving, nature-aligned society. So stay tuned. We'll keep track of the EBF as it continues to evolve. And I hope you'll take a moment to share this or any of the more than 500 episodes of Sustainability in Your Ear with a friend, with a family member, somebody that you meet on the street. Folks, writing a review on your favorite podcast platform will help your neighbors find us. You are the amplifier that can spread more ideas to create less waste. So please tell your friends, your family, coworkers, those people on the street that they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or whatever purveyor of podcast goodness they prefer. Thank you for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.